Welcome to the Audio Renaissance Tapes presentation of Zen and the Love of Nature. Written by Daisetsu T. Suzuki. Adapted for audio and produced by Tony Hutz. And read by Christopher Reed.
Before beginning, I wish to make a brief personal comment on the author and the text. D.T. Suzuki, Japan's foremost authority on Zen Buddhism, and the man who introduced Zen Buddhism to Western readers, died in Tokyo in 1966 at the age of 95. Zen and Japanese Culture, the work from which this program is drawn, consists primarily of a series of lectures Suzuki delivered during the 1930s in England and the United States, and should be viewed in its historical context. It is worth remembering that by the late 1940s, Suzuki expressed a wish to revise some of his earlier works on Japanese cultural identity, most especially those concerning the influence of Zen Buddhism on the Japanese martial traditions. Zen and Japanese Culture, however, remains as it was originally written. It remains a brilliant and seminal work on Zen Buddhism, from a scholar of immense breadth and depth. The Japanese love of nature, I often think, owes much to the presence of Mount Fuji in the middle part of the main island of Japan. Whenever I pass by the foot of the mountain as a passenger on the Tokaido railway line, I never fail to have a good view of it, weather permitting, and to admire its beautiful formation, always covered with spotless snow, and rising skyward like a white upturned folding fan, as it was once described by a poet of the Tokugawa period. The feeling it awakens does not seem to be all aesthetic in the line of the artistically beautiful. There is something about it spiritually pure and enhancing. Yamabe no Akahito, one of the earlier 8th century poets of Japan who sang of Mount Fuji, has this: "To the beach of Tago I come, and behold, in pure whiteness enveloped, there rises Mount Fuji, snowing, it seems, above us." Before going further, I should mention that in my translations of Japanese poetry, no attempt is made to reproduce the original rhythm. They are mostly literal renderings, with the fewest additions necessary to make the sense somewhat more intelligible to English listeners. Another poet, who has more religious feeling than Akahito of the Nara period, sings in the Manyoshu: "Extending over Suruga and Kai, Mount Fuji lifts its summit high. Even the clouds of heaven, struck with awe, dare not pass over that steep peak. Even the birds attempt in vain to soar over its giddy heights. It is a god that watches over Japan, over Yamato, the land of the sunrise. It is her sacred treasure and her glory upon the peak of Fuji in Suruga. Long may we gaze and never weary." Seigyo's poem of Fuji has a mystical vein. In his day, that is, in the 12th century, Fuji must still have been a live volcano, at least emitting smoke now and then. Such a sight is always inspiring. To see a solitary drifting cloud over a high peak carries one's thoughts away from earthly affairs. It was not the poets alone who were impressed with Fuji. Even a warrior had a feeling for it, expressing himself thus: "Each time I see Fuji, it appears changed, and I feel I view it ever for the first time. How shall I describe Fuji to those who have not yet seen it? It is never seen twice alike, and I know no one way of describing the sight." The singer is Date Masamune, who lived from 1565 to 1636, and who was one of the most renowned generals at the time of Hideyoshi and Ieyasu. He was a dauntless fighter, winning many fierce battles in which he personally took part. He was made the feudal lord of the district of Sendai, which is in the northeast section of Japan. Who would imagine such an active soldier in the warlike days of the 16th and 17th centuries finding room in his brain to appreciate nature and write poems on it. But such was actually the fact, and in it we recognize how innate the love of nature is in the Japanese heart. Even Hideyoshi, who rose from the peasant class, in his days a class badly downtrodden and hopelessly ignorant, composed poems and was a patron of the arts. His time is known as the Momoyama period in the history of Japanese art. Fuji is now thoroughly identified with Japan. Wherever Japan is talked or written about, Fuji is inevitably mentioned. Justifiably so, because even the land of the rising sun would surely lose much of her beauty if the sacred mountain were erased from the map. The mountain must be actually seen in order to impress. Pictures and photographs, however artistic, cannot do justice to the real view. As Masamune sings, it is never the same, it is ever changing in its features, as it is affected by atmospheric conditions, and also as it is viewed topographically from different angles and at different distances. To those who have never seen it, even Hiroshige fails to convey the real artistic value of the mountain, about which Yamaoka Teishu, a great 19th century swordsman, writes another poem from another point of view than Masamune. In fair weather, in cloudy weather, beautiful indeed and never changing, this peak of Fuji. In these prosaic days of ours, there is a craze among the young men of Japan for climbing high mountains just for the sake of climbing, and they call this conquering the mountains. What a desecration! This is a fashion no doubt imported from the West along with many others not always worthwhile learning. The idea of the so-called conquest of nature comes from Hellenism, I imagine, in which the earth is made to be man's servant, and the winds and the sea are to obey him. Hebraism concurs with this view too. In the East, however, this idea of subjecting nature to the commands or service of man according to his selfish desires has never been cherished, for nature to us has never been uncharitable. It is not a kind of enemy to be brought under man's power. We of the Orient have never conceived nature in the form of an opposing power. On the contrary, nature has been our constant friend and companion, who is to be absolutely trusted in spite of the frequent earthquakes assailing this land of ours. The idea of conquest is abhorrent. If we succeed in climbing a high mountain, why not say, we have made a good friend of it? To look around for objects to conquer is not the Oriental attitude towards nature. Yes, we climb Fuji too, but the purpose is not to conquer it, but to be impressed with its beauty, grandeur, and aloofness. It is also to worship a sublime morning sun rising gorgeously from behind the multicolored clouds. This is not necessarily an act of sun worship, though there is nothing spiritually degrading in that. The sun is the great benefactor of all life on earth, and it is only proper for us human beings to approach a benefactor of any kind, animate or inanimate, with a deep feeling of gratitude and appreciation. For this feeling is granted to us only. Lower animals seem to be wanting in this delicate sentiment. Some of the high mountains of popular interest in Japan are nowadays provided with a system of cable railways, and the summit is easily reached. The materialistic utilitarianism of modern life demands all such contrivances, and perhaps there is no escape from them. I myself often resort to them, for instance, when I go up to Hiei in Kyoto. Nevertheless, my feelings are revolted. The sight of the track, lighted up at night by electricity, reflects the modern spirit of sordid gain and pleasure hunting. At Mount Hiei, to the northeast of the ancient capital of Japan, which Dengyo Daishi first consecrated in the 8th century with his Tendai monastery and other institutions of his order, is to be treated with such ruthless commercialism is no doubt a cause of grief to many pious-hearted countrymen. In addition, in 1956, one of the buildings, called the lecture hall making up the group, was burned maliciously by one of the caretakers. This is an irreparable loss not only to the followers of Tendai, but to the cultural history of Japan. The incident is one of the bad examples reflecting the modern spirit of wanton vandalism. In the worshipful attitude towards nature, there is a highly religious feeling that I should like to see even in these days of science and economics and war. One may see how much in love with nature the Japanese is, in spite of his modern assertion of the conquest idea, if he builds a study, or rather a meditation room, somewhere in the mountain woods. It is not much of a building by the Western way of measurement, for it will be no more than a 4.5 mat or 6 mat room, about 10 or 15 feet square. It is thatched with straw, and it probably stands under a huge pine tree, protected by its outstretched branches. When viewed from a distance, the hut forms an insignificant part of the landscape, but it appears to be incorporated in it. It is by no means obtrusive. It belongs somehow to the general scheme of the view. As the master sits in this simple room, where there are no cumbrous pieces of furniture, perhaps only a table, a cushion, a flower vase, an incense burner, he finds that it is in no special way separated from the surroundings, from nature that encircles the hut. A cluster of plantain trees is growing near one of the oddly shaped windows. Some of their broad leaves are irregularly torn by a recent storm, and now they look like a monk's robe all in tatters. And for this reason, they appear more suggestive of the Zen poems of Han Shan, a monk of the Tang dynasty. It is not only the formation of these leaves which is poetic, but the way they, in fact, all plants, grow out of the earth, that makes the observer feel that he, too, is living the life they are living. The floor of the meditation room is not raised too far from the ground, just enough to keep the occupant from dampness, and yet to feel the common source from which all life shoots forth. A hut so constructed is an integral part of nature, and whoever sits here is one of its objects, like every other. This person is in no way different from the birds singing, the insects buzzing, the leaves swaying, the waters murmuring, nor even from Mount Fuji looming up on the other side of the bay. Here is a complete merging of nature, humanity, and its work, illustrated in a practical manner. As I speak of Fuji again, I am reminded of a poem by Ota Dokuan, a general of the 15th century. When he was asked by the emperor as to his residence, the general answered in this verse: "My hut is on the beach, lined with pine trees, and the high peak of Fuji looms up above the eaves." The emperor living in Kyoto had never seen the mountain in actuality, hence the poet soldier's special reference to it. And is it not interesting to notice here the way he describes his residence as a hut, ihori, or iho in Japanese? Being the warrior general who first established his headquarters at the present site of Tokyo before Ieyasu had his grand castle, Ota Dokuan's residence must have been of no mean magnitude. Yet he describes it as an ihori, with which we ordinarily associate the humble straw-thatched cottage of a recluse. His poetical, nature-loving spirit revolted against anything highly savoring of human artificiality. His hut naturally fits in with the stretch of pine trees, the wave-washed beach, and the snow-covered Fuji. In this respect, Dokuan truly reflects the love of nature that is the predominant note in the Japanese character. I sometimes wonder if any of the great Western soldiers ever turned into a poet. Can we imagine, for instance, in recent times, that General MacArthur or General Eisenhower would compose a poem upon visiting one of those bomb-torn cities? General Nogi of the Russo-Japanese War, after a great battle fought around Port Arthur in which he lost his 2 sons, wrote this poem in Chinese. How dreary and unconsolable they look, mountains and rivers, trees and grasses. The battlefield, newly won, for as much as 10 miles around is filled with an atmosphere odorous of spilt blood. The steed refuses to move on, and the man, grim and silent, stands all alone outside the fortress of Qinchao in the shadow of the setting sun. A grandly constructed building is too obtrusive an object to keep company with the surrounding objects of nature. From the practical point of view, it may serve its purpose well, but there is no poetry in it. Any artificial construction, with its object too prominent, detracts from its artistic value. It is only when it is in ruins and no more serves its original purpose that it is transformed into an object of nature and appreciated as such, though even in this appreciation there is much that has to do with the historical significance of the ruins themselves. The American liking for high buildings is no doubt economically necessitated, and I believe in some cases topographically also. But I suspect there is a certain psychological element in this fondness for tall architecture of any kind. Fundamentally, it is the desire to free oneself from the earth, for in one sense the earth symbolizes bondage, constriction, enthrallment, restraint of whatever kind from freedom and independence. In reality, one can never be free from the earth, for however high one may fly, one has finally to come down to earth. But since the development of the intellectual powers, people have conceived the idea of pushing this as far as it can go, even at the expense of other and possibly weightier interests. The towering architecture is the symbolization of the intellect, and modern man has forgotten or is as yet unconscious of the fact that this intellectualization is one of the causes contributing to all sorts of mental disturbance that we see about us. When I was in Chicago recently, I met the architect of a tall modern building who lives on the top floor of the same building. When I admired the fine views of the city and the lake it commands, for the room is well provided with large glass windows, the architect said, "That is true, but I have to confess that I have a feeling of insecurity, though I don't know why." The feeling of insecurity. Is this not the ailment most modern people suffer from, not only socially, but internationally? The intellect presses the button, the whole city is destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of human souls are crushed ignominiously to the ground. And the intellect will not have any compunction whatever. All is done mechanically, logically, systematically, and the intellect is perfectly satisfied, perhaps even when it destroys itself together with its victims. Is it not high time for us all to think of ourselves from another point of view than that of mere intellectuality? Do we not have to be much closer to the earth, where the nature-lover's hut humbly stands? Again, the emperor must have heard of the Musashino prairie, where Dokuan had his castle. Japan is a mountainous country with few plains, and the Musashino, where now stands the capital of the country, is one of the largest. The emperor, who had probably never left his mountain-encircled Kyoto, was curious to know how wide the Musashino was, so he asked Dokuan about it, and Dokuan replied in verse, "No dewdrops are seen around my hut, though a summer shower has just passed over the plain of Musashino. Far wider it must be than the rain clouds." This pleased the emperor immensely, and he gave the following reply to the much-talented warrior poet from the wild East. "I thought the Musashino was only a prairie with nothing but wild thistles. How pleasantly surprised I am to find such words in bloom." Dokuan is one of the most popular heroes with the Japanese. Unfortunately, he lived in the age when the Ashikaga shogunate was fast approaching its end, and the country was on the verge of general disorder. Dokuan was cravenly assassinated with a spear by his treacherous enemy. His farewell song was, "Until yesterday, this body of mine, like a worn-out hemunashi bag, was the depository of wrong attachments. Is it now for the last time burst The poet-general Ota Dokuan was fortunate to enjoy the mountain in white snow against the foaming waves of the blue ocean. But the hearts of the host and hostess of the dilapidated Ugetsu hut were torn between the moon and the autumnal raindrops, and they were greatly puzzled, not knowing what to do. Yet in this not knowing what to do with the hut, this time a really humble one, we recognize as much poetry as in the case of Dokuan, perhaps more of it. The Japanese love of nature is here graphically depicted. The story, in short, runs as follows. Ugetsu, meaning rain and moon, is one of the no plays adapted from an incident taking place in one of Saigyo's wanderings in Japan. Saigyo, the monk poet of the early Kamakura period, the 12th century, came one evening to a solitary house and asked for a night's lodging. An old couple was living there, and the house looked quite dilapidated. The old man refused to respond to the monk's request on the grounds that the accommodations were not good enough for him. However, his wife, seeing the traveler was a Buddhist monk, wished to give him lodging. But the fact remained the same. The hut was in no proper condition to entertain a stranger. The reason was this. The old lady loved the moonlight so much that the leaking roof was left unrepaired according to her desire. But the old gentleman loved to listen to the raindrops beating against the roof, which could not happen if the roof were left out of repair as it now was. Is the hut to be roofless for the moon, or is it to be put in order for the rain? The autumn is already here. The finest moon season is approaching, and at the same time the autumnal showers are so enjoyable when one sits quietly listening to them. As long as this problem was not decided, it would be highly inhospitable on the part of the host and the hostess to take any stranger into their house. They thought, our humble hut, is it to be thatched or not to be thatched? Saigyo exclaimed, here is a good poem already half composed. If you understand poetry, said the old couple, complete the stanza, and we will give you lodging, whatever it may be. Saigyo immediately responded, is the moonlight to leak? Are the showers to patter? Our thoughts are divided, and this humble hut, to be thatched or not to be thatched? The monk poet was now invited in. As the night advanced, the moon grew brighter, illuminating the faraway fields and mountains and shedding its light even inside the hut. But listen, showers are coming, trees are rustling. No, it is the dead leaves that are beating against the house, sounding like the raindrops. A wind is up, but the sky is clear as ever. It is a shower of falling leaves in the moonlight. A 13th century poem describes a moment like this in this way. When the dead leaves are falling thick, as I sit quietly at night in my room, difficult it is to judge whether it is showering or whether it is not showering. The falling leaves in autumn have often awakened the poetic sensibility of the nature-loving Japanese. The scene is suggestive of solitude and induces one to a meditative mood. Saigyo was also deeply impressed with it. While alone in his humble hermitage somewhere in the mountains, he was awakened during the night by the falling leaves striking shower-like against the roof and the amado, which no doubt greatly added to the feeling of aloneness, which is the spirit of autumn nature. By way of clarification, an amado is, literally, a rain door. The Japanese house has practically no windows in the Western sense. It is all doors, sliding doors, which serve to partition the rooms, admit light, protect the house against rain, snow, wind, etc. The amado are outside sliding doors, which are closed regularly at night or when the weather is inclement. The following poem is not merely descriptive, it reflects the mood of the season. May it be a passing shower that keeps me awake in bed. No, it is the autumn leaves falling without resistance before a squall. From the practical point of view, rain is an inconvenient thing, but in Japanese and also in Chinese poetry, much reference is made to rain, especially to a gentle rain such as we have in Japan, as whispering to us the inner secrets of reality. Listen to Saigyo again. Completely imprisoned in the spring rain, I am all alone in the solitary hut, unknown to humankind. To really understand the poetry and philosophy of the spring rain, one must live in Japan, in a small straw-thatched house, perhaps with a stretch of lawn and a little pond before one's 6-mat room. Unknown to humankind, but thoroughly acquainted with nature was the poet. Dogen, who lived in the 13th century, was the founder of the Soto branch of Zen Buddhism in Japan. The following is the most celebrated of his poems, worthwhile quoting in this connection. How we go like clouds drifting through births and deaths, the path of ignorance and the path of enlightenment, we walk dreaming. There's one thing only still in my memory even after waking, the sound of a rainfall to which I listened one night while at my Fukakusa retreat. Thoreau, in Chapter 5 of Walden, gives an inkling of what is sometimes designated as cosmic consciousness or cosmic feeling, which he cherished as he listened to rainfall. He wrote, I have never felt lonesome, or in the least oppressed by a sense of solitude. But once, and that was a few weeks after I came to the woods, when for an hour I doubted if the near neighborhood of man was not essential to a serene and healthy life. To be alone was something unpleasant, but I was at the same time conscious of a slight insanity in my mood, and seemed to foresee my recovery. In the midst of a gentle rain, while these thoughts prevailed, I was suddenly sensible of such sweet and beneficent society in nature, in the very pattering of the drops, and in every sound and sight around my house, an infinite and unaccountable friendliness all at once like an atmosphere sustaining me, has made the fancied advantages of human neighborhood insignificant, and I have never thought of them since. Every little pine needle expanded and swelled with sympathy and befriended me. I was so distinctly made aware of the presence of something kindred to me, even in scenes which we are accustomed to call wild and dreary, and also that the nearest of blood to me and humanist was not a person nor a villager, that I thought no place could ever be strange to me again." Unquote. Let us note here in passing how Oriental thoughts and feelings filtered into the American mind in the 19th century. The transcendentalist movement begun by the poets and philosophers of Concord is still continuing all over America, while the commercial and industrial expansion of America in the Far East and all the world over is a significant event of the 20th century. We must acknowledge at the same time that the Orient is contributing its quota to the intellectual wealth of the West, American as well as European. In 1844, Emerson wrote in response to Carlyle's chiding of his otherworldliness in these remarkable terms: "You sometimes charge me with I know not what sky-blue, sky-void idealism. As far as it is a partiality, I fear I may be more deeply infected than you think me. I have very joyful dreams which I cannot bring to paper, much less to any approach to practice, and I blame myself not at all for my reveries, but they have not yet got possession of my house and barn. I only worship eternal Buddha in the retirements and intermissions of Brahma." Unquote. Emerson's allusion to sky-void idealism is interesting. Apparently he means the Buddhist theory of shunyata, emptiness or void, although it is doubtful how deeply he entered into the spirit of this theory, which is the basic principle of the Buddhist thought and from which Zen starts on its mystic appreciation of nature. It is really wonderful to see the American mind, as represented by the exponents of transcendentalism, even trying to probe into the abysmal darkness of the Oriental fantasy. I am now beginning to understand the meaning of the deep impressions made upon me while reading Emerson in my college days. I was not then studying the American philosopher, but digging down into the recesses of my own thought, which had been there ever since the awakening of Oriental consciousness. That was the reason why I had felt so familiar with him. I was indeed making acquaintance with myself then. The same can be said of Thoreau. Who would not recognize his poetic affinity with Saigyo or Basho, and his perhaps unconscious indebtedness to the Oriental mode of feeling towards nature? To finish this part of my thesis, let me introduce you to a 10th century Zen master whose remark on rain is well known among the followers of Zen. It was raining one day, and Kyosho, the master, said to a monk, "What is the sound outside the door?" The monk answered, "The pattering of raindrops, master." This was an honest answer, and the master knew it from the first. His verdict, however, was, "All beings are confused in mind. They are pursuing outside objects always, not knowing where to find the real self." This is a hard hit. If the outside pattering is not to be called rain, what is it? What does it mean to pursue the outside objects and to be confused in the notion of the ego? Sekcho comments, "An empty hall and the sound of pattering rain, indeed an unanswerable question even for an accomplished master." The American transcendentalist's attitude towards nature has no doubt a great mystical note, but the Zen masters go far beyond it and are really incomprehensible. But we will drop the rain for a while, for it is now time to see into the teaching of Zen. To understand the cultural life of the Japanese people in all its different aspects, including their intensive love of nature, which we have spoken of just now, it is essential, as I have repeatedly stated, to delve into the secrets of Zen Buddhism. Without some knowledge of these, the Japanese character is difficult to appreciate. This does not, of course, mean that Zen is everything in the molding of the character and general culture of the Japanese people. What I mean is that when Zen is grasped, we can with some degree of ease get into the depths of their spiritual life in all its varied expressions. The fact is recognized, consciously or unconsciously, by scholars and by men in the street. The former recognize it in an analytical and critical manner worthy of their profession. The latter appreciate it by actually living it, in the delight they feel in listening to tales and traditions traceable somehow to the teaching of Zen Buddhism. That Zen has had a great deal to do in the building of Japanese character and culture is pointed out also by foreign writers on Japan, among whom we may mention the following. The late Sir Charles Eliot, who most unfortunately passed away without personally revising his valuable book, Japanese Buddhism, writes, "Zen has been a great power in the artistic, intellectual, and even the political life in the Far East. To a certain extent it has molded the Japanese character, but it is also the expression of that character. No other form of Buddhism is so thoroughly Japanese." Unquote. The one significant point here is that Zen is the expression of the Japanese character. Historically, Zen started in China about 1500 years ago, but it was not until the latter part of the Sung dynasty, that is, in the earlier part of the 13th century, that Zen was brought to Japan. Thus the history of Zen in Japan is far younger than in China. But it was so adaptable to the character of the Japanese people, especially in its moral and aesthetic aspects, that it has penetrated far more deeply and widely into Japanese life than into Chinese. Hence we see that the statement made by the author of Japanese Buddhism is not at all an exaggeration. Sir George Sansom, another capable English writer on Japan, makes the following observation on Zen in his Japan, A Short Cultural History. The influence of the school of Zen Buddhism upon Japan has been so subtle and pervading that it has become the essence of her finest culture. To follow its ramifications in thought and sentiment, in art, letters, and behavior, would be to write exhaustively the most difficult and the most fascinating chapter of her spiritual history. Unquote. While I may have occasion later to criticize this writer's view on the Japanese love of nature, The point he makes here is accurate, and I am in full agreement with him. What are the characteristic features of Zen as distinguished from the other forms of Buddhism? It will be necessary to know them before we proceed to see the relationship between Zen and the Japanese love of nature. Naturally, it is outside our scope of study here to enter in detail into what really and essentially constitutes Zen. Therefore, let the following brief statements here suffice concerning the teaching and discipline of Zen as regards its four aspects: religious, moral, aesthetic, and epistemological. In the first place, let me state that Zen is not a mere ascetic discipline. When we see a monk living in a humble hut and sustaining himself on rice and pickles and potatoes, we may imagine him to be a world-fleeing recluse, whose principle of life is self-abnegation. True, there is a certain side in his life tending to this, as Zen teaches a form of detachment and self-control. But if we imagine there is nothing more in Zen, we entertain a very superficial view of it. The Zen insights go far deeper into the source of life, where Zen is truly religious. By this I mean Zen is in close touch with reality. Indeed, Zen takes hold of it and lives it. And this is where Zen is religious.